We continue with the story The Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3 Fred and Richard Make a Plan. Mr. Richard Swiveller lived in a small rented room above a shop in an area of London famous for its theatres and cheap houses. And it was here that Fred had come to visit him one evening. Fred had spent nearly an hour listening to Richard talking about nothing important, and he was now walking up and down the room impatiently. "Richard," said Fred angrily, "I don't understand how you can be so cheerful with everything that has happened. I wish you would stop talking." "Well," said Mr. Swiveller, "I must say that you are very rude. I have invited you into my fashionable gentleman's apartment, and this is how you treat me? Well, I really don't know." "Judd," shouted Fred, returning to his chair, "will you talk seriously for 2 minutes? If I show you a way to make a lot of money with very little effort." Richard Swiveller immediately fell silent and stared at his friend. A moment passed before Fred spoke again. "Do you think my sister Nell is pretty?" "Well, yes, of course," replied Richard. "But I must say that you two don't look very similar at all." "Good. You think she's pretty," said Fred, choosing to ignore Richard's comment. "So, it's very clear that the old man and I never agree about anything, and that he's not going to give me any money, not even when he dies. You see that, don't you?" A bat could see that, even with the sun shining," said Richard, nodding his head. "Well," Fred went on, "Nell is a friendly girl, and because she is young, we can easily change what she thinks. You could make friends with her, and then she might be persuaded to marry you." Richard Swiveller, who could not believe that he had just heard, spoke just one word. "What?" "She could be persuaded to marry you," repeated Fred calmly. "And if you marry her, all the money could be yours." "But she's not even 14 years old," cried Richard. I don't mean you should marry her now," replied Fred impatiently. "I mean you could marry her in 3 or 4 years' time." Richard looked very uncertain. "Look," began Fred, "I think I could get her marry you, even if the old man lived for several more years. You would inherit all his money in the end. Then you and I would be able to spend it together. And just think, you would also have a beautiful wife." Richard thought for a moment. His rich aunt had been sending him money over the years, but in the last few months he had received nothing. She had heard about how he lived his life and wasted the money she sent him. Richard had sent her many letters asking, even begging for money, but she refused to help him. He had always expected to inherit her money, but that would certainly never happen now. He was poor and might always be poor. And you are sure that he is rich?" he asked Fred. Am I sure you heard what he said last week about Nell riding in an expensive carriage one day? Didn't you? Replied Fred. The conversation continued in this way. At first, Richard did not think Fred's idea was a good one. However, the truth was he was poor and greedy, and Fred was clever and persuasive. So, it was only an hour later that Richard Swiveller found himself agreeing to his friend's surprising new plan. End of chapter 3. Now I continue with chapter 4. Quilp uncovers a secret. Mr. Quilp did not have one particular job, but he did all sorts of different things for money. He collected the rent from the whole areas of dirty streets near the river Thames. He lent money to sailors, and he kept his eyes open for new and sometimes illegal business opportunities. He lived in Tower Hill near the London docks, but he also had a small yard full of rats called Quilp's Wharf, not far away on the southern side of the river Thames. It was a boat yard, but Quilp never seemed to buy or sell any boats there. He just used the old wooden building as a place to secretly keep and count all of his money. Nell's grandfather often asked her to come to this frightening, dangerous, and faraway place. He would ask her to deliver letters to Mr. Quilp. Today, Nell, who was very tired and worried, had brought another of those letters. When she arrived at the boatyard, the first thing she saw was Mr. Quilp and the young, untidy looking boy who worked for him. They were fighting in the yard. Quilp was shouting and then suddenly laughing loudly, and all the while he was hitting the boy hard with a large stick. At last the boy managed to pull away from his ugly master for a while. It was then that Quilp noticed Nell standing nearby. "Oh, Nellie!" he cried. "Yes," said the child uncertainly. "Come in. Don't worry about that boy," said Quilp, walking with Nell into the counting house. "I have brought an important letter from my grandfather," Nell explained, and handed the ugly little man the letter. Quilp, without saying a word, opened it and began to read. Quilp shook his head and said to himself, "It's all gone already? In just 24 hours? What on earth has he done with it? That is the mystery." Nell was uncomfortable and wanted to leave as soon as she could. A few moments passed during which nothing was said, but Quilp rubbed his hands together and scratched his head. You have brought a lot of these letters to me recently, haven't you, Nell? Quilp said coldly. Have you asked your grandfather why you have to bring them? Yes, I have asked him 100 times. But he won't tell me, replied Nell. It breaks my heart. He just shakes his head and looks sad, said the child. But he hasn't always been such a sad old man, has he? Said Quilp unkindly. Oh no, said the child quickly. We were once so happy, and he was so cheerful. But that has all changed since he and she stopped, unsure that she should tell him any more. Yes, said Mr. Quilp in a suddenly gentler voice. Since he I don't know, replied Nell. Come on, Nell, you can tell me anything. In fact, I won't let you go until you tell me. So, since he repeated. Well, since he started going out all night, every night, finished Nell. I don't know where he goes. He has no sleep or rest, apart from in his chair during the day. Quilp said nothing, but simply nodded his head. Quilp wanted the child to say more. When he comes home early in the morning, continued the child, I let him in. This morning I saw that his face was white and he looked ill. And later, when he didn't know I was in the room, I heard him say that he couldn't bear his life any more. He said, I can't believe how unlucky I have been with the cards I've been dealt. And then he said, if I didn't have young Nell, I would wish to die. Oh, what will I do? Then the child hid her face in her hands and started to cry. Quilp looked about him as if he was deep in thought. He stared at Nell, then reached out and put his hand heavily on her shoulder. Nell immediately stopped crying and moved quickly away from him. I have been away too long, sir. I have to go now, said Nell, drying her eyes. Mr. Quilp went to his desk and started to write. Then he turned to Nell and said, Take this note to him. It's only to say that I will see him tomorrow and that I couldn't do what he has asked me to do in this letter. Goodbye, Nellie? Mr. Quilp waited for 2 days before he went to see the old man in the old curiosity shop. When he went inside, he found Nell's grandfather alone in the shop. "At last," cried the old man, "have you brought me any money?" "No, never again," answered Quilp. "Then," said the old man, standing up from his chair, "Nell and I have no hope." "Listen to me," said Quilp, beating his hand on the table. "You have no secret from me now." The old man stared at Quilp with fear in his eyes. "I now know what has happened to all that money I have lent you," Quilp said. "Every night you have been going out with my money and gambling with it, haven't you? Was that your secret plan? To make your fortune by playing cards?" "Yes," cried the old man. "And I thought you were investing my money carefully in some clever business opportunity." "I have been tricked by a gambler," said Quilp, looking at him in anger. I am not a gambler," cried the old man. I've never played cards to make money for myself or because I love gambling. I have done only to try and save Nell." "Sir," said Quilp, I suppose you spent all your money first and then you came to me for some more." "While you said you were making yourself rich, you were actually making yourself a beggar, dear me? And of course I hold every security you were able to give me, including the letter which says that this building and everything in it now belongs to me." As he said this, Quilp looked around him as if to make sure that none of it had been taken away. "I've had some bad luck," said the old man. "But with a little more money, my luck will change. It must change. Help me, please, or at least help Nell." "I'm sorry. I've got another business appointment," said Quilp, calmly looking at his watch. "If I hadn't unexpectedly heard about your gambling secret, perhaps I would have lent you more money. But not now." Who was it that told you?" asked the old man. Quilp simply replied, Who do you think it was?" After a moment's thought, the old man said, "It was Kit?" "Yes, it must have been him," Mr. Quilp said brightly. "Yes, it was Kit. Poor Kit." And then he turned and walked to the door and left. That is the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Everything changes. Someone hiding in the shadows across the street, had been carefully watching the old curiosity shop. He had seen Daniel Quilp arrive and leave, and had noticed that the old man had not left the house that evening as usual. This person used to wait for hours and hours every night, watching the house and making sure that Nell was safe while her grandfather was gone. This kind and thoughtful person was Kit. Sometime later, once Kit knew Nell would not be alone that night, he went home to his widowed mother and his two young brothers. "Ah, Kit," cried his mother, when he walked into the small and simple room. "I wonder what Nell would say if she knew that every night when she is sitting alone, you are out there on the street keeping an eye on her." She looked closely at Kit and then said, "Some people might say you have fallen in love with her." Kit, whose face was starting to turn red, was saved by a loud knock at the door. It was Nell herself, looking worried and upset. "I must not stay long," she said. "Grandfather is very ill." "I'll run to get a doctor," said Kit, picking up his coat. "I'll be there soon. I—" "No, no," cried Nell. "The doctor is there already, and I don't know why, but grandfather's very angry with you and says you are the cause of all his problems." Kit looked at her with his eyes open wide. "The doctor says you must not come near him or he will die," added Nell, who had started to cry. "Oh, Kit, what have you done? I trusted you. You were the only friend I had," said Kit. Kit was so shocked that he could not speak. Nell gave him the money that he had earned that week and then was gone as quickly as she had come. Nell's grandfather became seriously ill and could not move from his bed. Despite this, within a few days, Mr. Quilp closed the shop and made the house and everything in it his own. He then decided to live for a while in the back rooms of the ground floor with his lawyer, a man called Mr. Samson Brass. Mr. Brass was a tall, thin man with an ugly nose, a large forehead, very small eyes, and the hair of a deep red. He wore a very long black coat, short black trousers, and high shoes. He was not very pleasant man and he was clearly afraid of Daniel Quilp. Will we be staying here long? Asked Mr. Brass. We must stay, I suppose, until the old man upstairs is dead, answered Quilp. Or, if he doesn't die quickly, we will just tell him and his granddaughter to leave. Cried Mr. Brass, trying to laugh. Nell stayed away from Quilp and his lawyer friend and spent most of the next few weeks beside her sick grandfather's bed. One night she was sitting alone by the open window when Kit came and called her from the street below. I hope you don't really believe that I have done anything wrong, Nell, he shouted up to her. I can say with a true and honest heart that I haven't. When your grandfather gets better, will you tell him that? I want to work for him again. If I did tell him, what good would it do? We are very poor now, so we wouldn't be able to pay you, said Nell sadly. I don't care about the money, replied Kit. I just thought if he believed me, then you could both come and live with my family. Just for a while. Ours is a small and simple home, but it's very clean. But just then Mr. Brass came out and chased Kit away. Many people came to the house while her grandfather was ill, but Nell had never felt more lonely. And she knew that her grandfather would never agree to live at Kit's house. It was not long until her grandfather's illness passed. However, he was very weak. He was different now. He was confused. And what he said often did not make sense. As soon as he could see that the old man was feeling a little better, Mr. Quilp said that he was going to sell everything in the house and the shop. He told Nell that she and her grandfather would have to leave and find somewhere else to live. Hearing this news, Nell began to cry and turned to her weak grandfather. Let's go, she said to him. Let's leave this place and never come back or think of it again. We can live as beggars and be happy. I'm not afraid. We can walk through the countryside and sleep in the fields and under the trees. In the day, you can rest, and I will knock on doors and beg for money. We will feel the sun and wind on our faces. The old man looked at his granddaughter for a few moments. There were tears in his eyes as he replied, Yes, let's do that, but We must keep our plan secret. If anyone finds out, they will think that I am mad and take you from me. Then he added, We will be all right, you and I together, Nell, forever. The child's heart was suddenly full of hope. She did not think of hunger or cold or thirst or difficulties. She saw an end to their sadness and return to the happy life they had once enjoyed together. She thought of the sun and rivers and green grass and summer days, and there were no dark corners in the picture she saw. They left the house quietly the next morning before Quilp and Mr. Brass were awake. It was the beginning of a bright day in June, and as they stood in front of the old curiosity shop, Nell asked her grandfather, Which way should we go? The old man looked helplessly first at her, then to the right and left, and then at her again, and shook his head. From that moment, Nell knew that she would always have to look after both of them. She took a deep breath and then held her grandfather's hand and led him away. End of chapter 5.